This is Brent Allan Winters, commonlawyer.com, and we are looking at the Constitution of the United States. This is the fourth part of it'll be more than 3 or 4 parts. We don't know how many parts it will be. We'll go till we can either get done or can't go anymore because of circumstances beyond our control, but it's the fourth part in a series concerning the question whether the Constitution of the United States is biblical. Last time we looked at the preamble of the Constitution. The first two parts of this series, we laid down some threshold matters concerning the Constitution, and as we go along, we'll certainly lay down more as they come to mind. But in the last part of this series, part 3, we looked at the preamble, and we said that in the preamble is included the words, the blessings of liberty, which is the drafter's attempt to sum up the purposes of the Constitution. And we said that if the Constitution were a ring of gold, and if the 6 elements listed, the 6 purposes of the preamble of the Constitution, were a suite of jewels on top of that ring, then right in the center, the largest jewel in that suite would be the purpose listed here, to ensure domestic tranquility. And we talked about domestic tranquility being the old common law idea of peace. Not peace as the world gives, but peace as it was understood in our common law anciently, in the days of the Anglo-Saxons, long before William the Conqueror decided to come and try to take the crown of England, which he did. In those days, peace was defined according to the man. It was the peace of every man. Every man had a peace, and the kingdom had his peace, its peace. That is where the authority of the king of England ran. The king himself, being a man, had peace called the peace of the king, and to break the integrity of that peace of any man was a wrong that was actionable in court. It could be done by slandering another man, or it could be done by a battery or an assault or a threat, or by injury itself. And the common law, of course, has always said that you can't get into court unless there is a bloody plaintiff. What does that mean? That's just a figure of speech. It means unless there is an injury of fact. Well, what does of another person? That means unless the peace of that person has been breached. And the words domestic tranquility are other words used to describe the concept of peace. And we went on to say that the peace in the Bible is comparable in this sense. Jesus said, I give you not peace as the world gives, but I give you my peace. And his peace, of course, was the Older Testament concept of peace, which was not, as we pointed out, the absence of war or conflict, but the presence of order in the midst of conflict. I didn't use this example then, yesterday, but I can use it now in part 4 as an illustration of the power of domestic tranquility as a country, or domestic tranquility in a person, the peace of a person, because the peace of a person results from ordering his life according to the orders of the God of all order. And the person who orders his life thusly, according to the God of order, will win over the empire of evil. To quote Kipling on the subject, the heathen in his blindness bows down to wood and stone, said Kipling. He don't obey no orders unless they be his own. The heathen in his blindness, of course, doesn't know what he's about, so along comes the British regiment and pokes the heathen out. Well, the lesson of that particular little poem is that order defeats non-order in battle. And there's no question. God's man stays in battle the duration of his life. The Bible says it pretty much just that way. Life teaches us that. We war not against flesh and blood, it says, but against principalities and powers, Paul tells the Christians at Ephesus. And although we wrestle against principalities and powers, those principalities and powers that are unseen, I like to say persons without bodies, they utilize persons with bodies, real men, to do their dirty deeds. They're lackeys, useful idiots. Stalin called his helpers, and he was part of the evil empire. But we are at warfare, and because we're at warfare, we should be able to relax and work like clockwork if we have our lives ordered. Our affairs must be in order. Our minds must be in order, and that's where it all starts. But only God, through His Son, Jesus Christ, can provide that order, but that's the basis of domestic tranquility in our Constitution. It is the order of the common law, the laws of nature. And we said also that the Bible is, as Blackstone tells us, the laws of nature's God, and we have them both in the Declaration of Independence. I probably ought to I'm thinking, drop a footnote here as I think about it. It is said that the Constitution of the United States does not mention God. We said, however, though, in the preamble, it does say that the reason for this Constitution is to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Well, the blessings of liberty had been added, but they wanted to make sure God gave them to us, but they said, we want to secure them. Why, pray tell, isn't God mentioned more direct? He is mentioned, he is acknowledged in that word blessing, and we pointed out that in the English language the word blessing is always used, I couldn't find a place where it wasn't used, to refer to divine providence. It's related to the old Anglo-Saxon word, we still use them, blithe and bliss, and by the way, both of those words were at one time, up until then, used exclusively for the divine provision of God. But that is an indirect acknowledgement of God, to speak of the blessings of God, and God is not spoken of directly in the Constitution. Well, let's talk about a bit the reasons that is so. At the states ratifying of the Constitution of the United States, or as I like to say, of the States United, because the phrase United States has become hackneyed till it's just words, we don't think about what it means, we need to. The States United, 9 of those 13 states had state-supported, ordained, and ordered religious institutions. All of those states were Christian by de facto reality. What does that mean? That means they were not Christian by law as much as they were Christian by fact. Most everybody, without exception, that lived in the colonies were, if not Christian in reality, were Christian in name and thought of themselves as Christian. They thought of nothing else. And the great fear of the people in the colonies, the great fear that they held for the Constitution, was that it would trump their sovereignty as independent countries, which they were at that time confederated together nonetheless, but still each was independent and sovereign as far as earthly sovereignty goes, and they feared that the federal government would be formed and dominate their freedom of religion, the freedom of religion they as a state had chosen to support publicly, even with tax dollars, in 9 of 13 cases. So the framers, or those that drafted the Constitution, were careful to leave any sectarian words out of the Constitution. Our Bible translations, our English Bible translations, have suffered the same thing. For example, back in the days of Henry VIII, the bishops, the Romanized bishops of the church, had practices of the church that they forced upon the adherents of the country of England under that state-supported religion called Romanism. Later it was Romanism with a new pope called Henry VIII. Under all that, the priests of the church had certain words that were from the Latin days of Christianity, which, by the way, was still in force at that time. And they said, if there are any English translations of the Bible, well, that's okay, they said, but there are about 260 words we don't want and we think by law should not be allowed to be translated. In other words, they wanted to keep those words. They didn't want them translated, they wanted them transliterated. What does that mean? That means that they wanted the English translators, when they came to those words, to use English letters to approximate the pronunciation of those Latin or Greek words. For example, the word baptism in the King James translation is not a translation of the word for baptism in the Greek New Testament. It is a transliteration. It is an attempt to use English letters to approximate the pronunciation of the Greek word baptizo, from the root bap, which means to inundate, to overwhelm. in some people's understanding, to immerse, which is an extension of the meaning more than a translation. But in any case, it does mean to get whatever you're dealing with under the water. And by the way, the word baptizo means to leave it there so it never comes out. Spoken of ships that are sunk in battle, Homer uses it that way, never to be submerged and never to be raised again, never to be seen again, which, by the way, symbolically is what happens in baptism. It is a burying of a man, of the old man, never to rise again, and the new man that comes out of the water is a new creature, as Paul says. The old man is left buried, Romans chapter 6. But it's all symbolic, but the point I'm making is the translators didn't translate that word because King James wanted to unify his kingdom. He didn't want to tear it apart further. And one way to do that is to avoid all controversy over that thing that is still controversial, and that is baptism. I had a radio show a few years ago, and it lasted about a year, and sometimes the subject of baptism would come up. And of all the subjects that came up, it was talk radio in one sense, all the subjects that came up, that subject elicited, without us even trying, more telephone calls and comments and letters than any other. It's still a divisive subject, but avoidance of the subject is not proper. Our God wants us to meet controversial questions head on and deal with them. Well, the Constitution didn't try to avoid them by subversion, as did the King James translators with the issue of baptism. And I was going to tell you about the other priests that said there were 260 words they wanted transliterated, and one contemporary of the day said the only reason he wanted those words translated, he said the only reason those priests don't want those words translated, they want to keep those words because those words keep them. Words like penance, well, that came down to meaning we want you to give us money. Well, they didn't want that to go away. They didn't want that translated repens, which means a change of mind. So here we come to the Constitution. The men there didn't want to deal with all that trouble that Christianity had put upon them, but they didn't try to use the subversion of transliteration. They just said the colonies have religious freedom. The federal government is not here to in any way impose a threat, to make any comment, to have anything to do with religion. And remember, in those days, the only religion of any consequence in the colonies was Christianity under its various sects and forms. So the framers decided they would not use any words, any terms of theology or Christianity. For example, even though the Constitution, as does the common law, sets up a system of elder rule, as does Paul, the apostle, in the New Testament and even in the Old Testament, the Constitution, never uses the word presbytos from the New Testament, nor presbytery, nor even the word elders, which was the churches had begun to use, but tried to use words that were never used by any sect of the Protestant Church since the days of the Reformation, such as senators, which is related to the word, amazingly, the word senile, which in Latin means old age, but it's a word that was never used in ecclesiastical polity, never used in the church. And by not using those words, or such words as that, the people who drafted the Constitution intended to avoid any appearance of threat to the freedom of religion of the colonies and of the state-supported churches in 9 of those 13 colonies. I said colonies. By that time they were states, they were independent countries, but they were the previous 13 colonies that had existed under English charters and English authority. To put it another way, those that drafted the Constitution sought to maintain absolute neutrality when it came to Christianity. Now, I can't say that they intended to maintain absolute neutrality when it came to religion beyond Christianity. Indeed, the government that is set forth under the Constitution is a restatement of the common law, which is Christian, as Justice Story says, at its very foundations. Those things being said, and they'll probably come up again in this discussion. If they do, we'll mention them again. The time has come to get beyond the preamble and into the text of our Constitution, so that we can decide whether or not it is biblical and at what points. It says this in Article 1, Section 1, Clause 1. All legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and House of Representatives. Now remember, it says in the preamble that the people of the United States, in order to do these 6 things, it says in the preamble, ordain and establish the Constitution, and then the first thing they do is ordain and establish in the Constitution the legislative powers of the United States. Well, some have asked the question, well, how did the people of the United States get that legislative power? Well, the Declaration of Independence, of course, acknowledges that legislative power and says that because it was withheld from the legislatures of the colonies, it reverted back to the people. So the Declaration of Independence acknowledges that the legislative powers reside in the people. But then the question comes, how did those powers get to the people? Well, the Constitution had that right too. It says in the beginning of the Constitution that, I didn't mean the Constitution, in the beginning of the Declaration of Independence, in paragraph 2, it says that there are certain self-evident truths. That means these are truths that we accept by judicial notice. We, as premises, we don't need to prove them. It's so abundantly obvious that we just going to accept them and then reason beyond them. It says all men are created equal, and that their Creator has endowed them. That means he has clothed them, literally, with rights that are unalienable. That means they cannot be separated from those rights. That among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It doesn't define all the rights. It says certain rights, and among these rights, one of those rights that men are given is the power of legislation. Now, that does not mean that right arises in them. No, it does not. It has arisen, and its source and spring and fountain is the God who grants all rights. You may say, you mean men have the right to legislate, make laws? Yes, they do in this sense. Every situation every person faces, every moment of every day, he must make choices about what to do, some things of great consequence, some seemingly of small consequence. But nonetheless, choices are part of being a free man. Somebody did a study once, and then they said that people who have their freedom taken away, their freedom of bodily movement, in other words, people in prisons, make, on average, a couple of hundred decisions a day. People outside of prison make about 10 times as many decisions a day. Freedom is all about the right, that is the authority, that is the jurisdiction to make certain choices. Every person has a jurisdiction to make certain choices and to fulfill those choices. That doesn't mean every person can make every choice every person wants to make, but there are certain choices that he can make within the jurisdiction that God has given to that person. That means he, for himself, or for a little group upon which all agree, can legislate. They can set rules, and rightfully so, about their relationships. When people draw up contracts or have agreements, they set rules as between themselves. In the strictest sense, that is the power, the authority to legislate and to agree upon the behavior, the rules that govern the behavior as to their relationship. If men get together and have a little group, form a little organization, they'll lay down rules. Those rules, you can call them what you want. You can call them bylaws. You can call them ordinances. You can call them just plain rules. But once they have drawn them up and set them in writing, they become a form of legislation. Listen, the word legislation or legislature is just an old Latin word, and it means to establish laws, to establish rules. Undoubtedly, every person does that when they make choices about what they're going to do, and they set standards for themselves. When they set, for example, New Year's resolutions, or just any resolution, or every time a person makes a commitment to another person, or to do a certain thing, or even a commitment to themselves, or a commitment to God, in one sense, they're setting the boundaries of their behavior. They're applying those boundaries to themselves to act or not to act within a certain scope. It is undeniable by the laws of nature, that is, the law unwritten that God has given us outside the Bible, and by the laws of nature, that is, the laws written in the Bible, that we have the power to make those kind of commitments, and those kind of commitments are legislation. The Declaration of Independence was clearly a commitment to do certain things. The Covenanters of Scotland that wrote up the covenants in the 1600s and the 1640s and the 1630s committed their lives and their fortunes and their honor to do certain things to one another. The Puritans that came together were from a place called Scrooby, England. Pronounce it as correct as I can. Well, they got together in a barn where they had secret church meetings, and they made a commitment one to another to speak the words of God into one another. Those were the pilgrims that eventually came to Virginia. In the Bible, the Israelites that returned from Babylon got together and they covenanted with one another, made a commitment. Ultimately, what it amounted to was to reestablish the city of Jerusalem, build the walls, to stay there. Well, that is tantamount in the sense of the word legislation, an old Latin word, to making law. Well, if men get together, as these men did at the Constitution, to form a country, they can agree to send representatives into two houses, as they've done here in the first article of our Constitution, to set boundaries and make laws. And certainly those who went before them in Puritan New England and in Virginia, and the Presbyterians that were scattered throughout the colonies from the Ulster plantation in Scotland, even down in Georgia, all of those people had set rules about their behavior in their respective colonies. We might make a point here about the colonies become states in America. There were 13 of them. All of them were Protestant to the core. There were about 3 million, just shy short, maybe 100 people short from the best records we can gather. A little over 2,900,000 people in the American colonies at the time of the Revolution, and of course a few more by the time of the Declaration of Independence. Then by the 1800s, there were 12 million people approximately in the American colonies. That's how fast people from Europe flocked to the colonies when they understood the freedom that was available here. But of that approximately 3 million people in the colonies, 1 million of those people were of English stock and were, to a man and a woman, Anglican, Congregationalist, and Puritan. All three of those were parts of what we'd call the Church of England, Anglicanism. But the Puritans were most biblical, probably, and most fundamental, very much so. As a matter of fact, Winston Churchill called them the most biblical race of men that ever lived. I don't disagree. They tried hard to understand the Bible, that's for sure, more so than many others. Another third of the people that lived here were German and Dutch Reformed people, another almost million, just less than a million. And they, of course, were Protestant, and they also were a very biblical race of men and women. And they were of the same biblical, theological understanding as the Puritans, substantially the same, Reformed in their faith, as were the Puritans. Another Reformed group amounted to almost a million. That was the Scotch-Irish Presbyterians. That were Scotch mostly, had transplanted to the Ulster plantation of Northern Ireland, and then had come to the Americas, bringing with them their Presbyterianism. Presbyterianism, to put it in plain English, is rule by elders. The New Testament word is presbytos, that's the Greek word, from the Greek New Testament, and they believed in rule by an eldership. Then there was about 0.6% of the American colonies. People living here at that time were Roman Catholic, and they almost all lived in Maryland, which was founded as a Roman Catholic colony. About 0.6%, not very many. And then, from the best figures we can gather, about 2% were Jewish, but that was of negligible amounts, and they were scattered, I think, from what I can gather, throughout the colonies. And then the remaining 0.2% were various forms of Christian, called themselves other than Reformed, but they were product of the Protestant Reformation, although the Baptist of them would have denied that. But they were people that were very much like the Reformed people in this respect that they believed the Bible to be the final authority for their lives. So the Bible held sway, and much talk is made of the framers of the Constitution as though they were the ones in charge. That's not true. They were politicians, and they followed the heartbeat of those people whom they had to please. They spoke their language. They tried to speak their thoughts back to them. Otherwise, they would not have stayed in power. That's how strong the biblical commitment was in America at that time, more so than any place in the world, probably, up till that day. Even Israel of old never experienced the commitment to the Bible that we have seen, that we see recorded in history in the American colonies, the American British colonies. Indeed, the Old Testament history of Israel is a history of God's absolute faithfulness to his people and their absolute unfaithfulness, with some scattered exceptions. Important, but nonetheless always confined to a very small remnant of the people of Israel. So we've tried to define here what legislation is, and I want to add before we quit that legislation, as it's understood in the Hebrew terms of the Old Testament, and by the way, those are the foundation concepts for the New Testament. To understand the Old Testament is to much better understand the New. We have to start there. And it's sad that much of the church gets that turned around and seeks the foundational understanding for all things in the New Testament. Jesus didn't do it that way, and neither did Paul the Apostle and the other writers of the New Testament, James and John. And we shouldn't either. And by the way, Puritans understood the Old Testament as the foundation, as did the Scotch-Irish Presbyterians and the German Dutch Reformed people in the colonies at the time our country was founded. Never forget the Constitution, even above the preamble, was written for one reason, and that reason is to limit the power of the federal government. There were 13 other governments in place, not to mention many smaller governments within those 13 sovereignties. And the federal government was established to be extremely limited. But as a matter of fact, there were only 4 crimes listed in the federal Constitution. We've gone much beyond that. We have violated the Constitution in that respect. Congress had only power to legislate according to Section 8 of Article 1, the powers listed therein, and there are not many of them. And just because the federal government, Congress, and those other lackeys of the sway of the evil empire that operate within our government, including all the bureaucracies and those that work, the bureaucrats that work there, because they have exceeded the bounds of the Constitution, is not an argument against it any more than the fact that the church pays little attention to the Bible and the laws of God written therein, that's an argument against the validity of God's law in the Bible. Of course, that's not an argument against the validity of God's law. God's law stands regardless of what those people claiming to be God's people do with it, and they will abuse it as they have for many centuries, and as the law of God in the book of Deuteronomy promised would happen. Fortunately, as Christian people, when that occurs, we have a remedy, and that remedy is the person of Jesus Christ, who paid the price and the penalty for our sins in denying God's law and God's standard. And make no mistake about it, sin is violation of God's law, violation of His standards. Well, the legislative powers reside in the people because God gave it to us to make rules for ourselves and to decide for ourselves how our relationships with other people are to be governed. I suppose the thread of truth running through the uses and the idea, the concept, although different words are used than legislation to deliver the concept we call legislation. The Bible uses Hebrew and Greek words to do that. But legislation probably would be understood best to say it's something that is written down, something that is made permanent. In the Old Testament, the Hebrew word is lachak or lachach, but it means that which is etched or engraved in stone. And by figure of speech, the idea there is legislation is statutes, is one of the way it's translated, and it means that which is made permanent by its being written down. And by the way, legislation should be nothing but writing down of the standards of God. Let's make one other point. The law of God changes through the years. No. I misspoke. The law of God never changes. But the expression that men give to the law of God inevitably changes through the years as we, for example, try to express it, as I've been trying to do here for a long time, express the word legislation as in English, trying to get across the idea of the Hebrew word, lachak. God has given many expressions of His standards and His laws, And granted, we need to stick as close as we can to the words of the Bible and their understanding and keep, as the Reformers said, harking back to the fountain. You can drink from the rivulets of the translations of the Bible and the things that flow out of the fountain, but God is the fountain, and His first giving of, for example, His law is in the Bible, and it's in the original manuscripts, of which we have reliable copies, and it doesn't hurt to go back to those as much as we possibly can. The original documents, in other words. Well, this is Brent Allan Winters, commonlawyer.com, and there are more materials on the website that you can look at there to flesh out these concepts of which I speak. There's 6 or 7 books I've written to try to explain some of these things, and some audio recordings that you can listen to. Some you can buy if you like to listen while you drive or otherwise. But we've looked here at what the legislative powers are in Article 1, that they're granted in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate, that's a body of elders, and a House of Representatives, which is also the same things, and we'll talk more about that, Lord willing, in Part 5 of this series. This is Brent Allan Winters, commonlawyer.com.